In the summer of 1494, a young man rode out of Florence to meet the French army. His name was Piero de' Medici. He was 22 years old. His grandfather had been called the father of his country. His father had been called the Magnificent. Piero would be called something else entirely. He rode out to negotiate. He returned having surrendered every significant Florentine military asset along the Ligurian coast. Ports, fortresses, strategic positions, all of it, without conditions, without consultation, without the minimum display of resistance that Florentine pride required. Within days, the city that had tolerated 60 years of Medici dominance because the family had been worth tolerating rose against him. The Medici palace was sacked. The family's possessions were seized. Piero and his brothers fled. History gave him the name Piero the Unfortunate. Behind him, in the palace his family had occupied for 3 generations, the greatest private art collection in the world waited to be inventoried by the new government. The Botticellis, the works commissioned from a young sculptor named Michelangelo, who had been raised in the household as one of the family's own, the manuscripts, the bronzes, the ancient coins that Lorenzo had collected with the obsessive attention of someone who understood that the past was one of the tools available to the present. And behind all of it, at the centre of everything the Medici had built, the bank. The Medici Bank had been, for most of the 15th century, the largest and most respected financial institution in Europe. It had branches in Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, London, and Bruges. It had pioneered financial instruments that are still in use today. It had financed popes and kings and the commercial infrastructure of an entire civilization. It had been the mechanism by which a family of wool merchants from a minor Florentine neighbourhood had become the most powerful private citizens in Europe. By 1494, the bank was effectively finished. The branches had closed, one by one, as the bad loans accumulated and the political protection that had been the bank's foundation dissolved. The last formal operations wound down by 1499. The bank was gone. The family was not. What happened to the Medici after they lost Florence is one of the most extraordinary stories of institutional adaptation in the history of Western civilization. They lost the bank, they lost the city, they were exiled twice, and they came back both times using different instruments of power than the ones they had lost. They came back through the church, they came back through marriage, they came back as dukes and queens and popes. The banking family became a dynasty, and the dynasty, when it finally exhausted itself in the 18th century, left behind a set of institutions and practices and innovations that the modern world still uses without knowing where they came from. This is the story of what happened after 1494. To understand what the Medici lost, you have to understand what they had built. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founded the Medici Bank in Florence in 1397. He was not the first Medici banker. The family had been involved in finance and commerce for generations. But Giovanni was the one who understood that the most reliable customer in Europe was the Pope. The papacy, in the 15th century, was one of the largest financial operations on the continent. It collected revenues from churches across Europe, managed properties across multiple territories, financed wars and crusades, and the construction of cathedrals, and needed banking services of a sophistication that most institutions could not provide. Giovanni secured the papal account. The Medici Bank became the Pope's primary banker. Their papal connections gave them exclusive access to church finances. This was not merely a business advantage. It was a structural advantage of the kind that, once established, compounds over time. The papal banking relationship gave the Medici access to the money flows of the entire Catholic world. It gave them intelligence about the financial situations of every major European power that owed money to, or was owed money by the Church. It gave them a client whose creditworthiness was, in the 15th century, essentially unquestioned. Giovanni built carefully. He maintained the holding company structure, a central partnership in Florence that held stakes in subsidiary partnerships in each city where the bank operated. Each branch was a separate legal entity, which meant that problems at one branch did not automatically infect the others. This structural innovation, separating parent from subsidiaries, is the basic architecture of the modern multinational corporation. Giovanni invented it because he needed it, not because he understood he was inventing something that would outlast the bank by several centuries. His son, Cosimo, inherited the bank and the political position in Florence, that the bank's wealth had enabled. Cosimo was exiled by the Albizzi family in 1433, spent a year in Venice, and returned in 1434 when Florence's political situation had deteriorated enough that his opponents had lost their support. He came back not as an exile seeking forgiveness, but as the solution to a problem that Florence had created by removing him. He never held official office. He was a private citizen, and he ran Florence for 30 years through the specific mechanism that the bank had built: financial obligation. The families and institutions that owed the Medici money had reasons to support Medici interests. The artists and scholars whose careers the Medici patronized had reasons to celebrate Medici culture. The papal relationship meant that challenging the Medici meant potentially challenging the church. Pope Pius II said of Cosimo, "He is king in everything but name." The description was accurate and it described the innovation. The Medici had found a way to exercise royal power without holding royal title, without the military obligation that royal title required, and without the vulnerability that royal title carried. A king could be deposed. A private citizen who was also the Pope's banker and the city's largest creditor was harder to remove. In April 1478, someone tried to kill Lorenzo de' Medici during High Mass in the Florence Cathedral. The attack was organised by the Pazzi family, rivals of the Medici in Florentine banking, and it was backed by Pope Sixtus IV, who had his own reasons for wanting the Medici removed from their position as papal bankers. The specific grievance was the Medici's refusal to provide financing for the Pope's nephew to purchase the town of Imola, a transaction that the Medici Bank declined on commercial grounds. The Pope found alternative financing through the Pazzi and resolved to remove the people who had said no. The attack happened on April 26, 1478. Two priests, who had been persuaded to participate by assurances that killing in the service of the church was not sinful, attacked Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano simultaneously during the elevation of the host. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times. He died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo was stabbed in the neck but managed to escape, partly by drawing his sword, partly by being dragged to safety by members of his household. He survived. His brother did not. The aftermath of the Pazzi conspiracy demonstrated something important about the nature of Medici power. The attack was supposed to trigger a popular uprising against the Medici. Instead, it triggered a popular uprising in their defense. The Pazzi conspirators who could be caught were hunted down and killed, some of them by the crowd before the authorities could reach them. The bodies were displayed from windows. The Pazzi family was expelled from Florence, their properties confiscated, their name ordered removed from public records. Lorenzo emerged from the Pazzi conspiracy with his political position stronger than it had been before the attack. The attempt on his life had demonstrated that he had popular support that even a Pope-backed conspiracy could not undermine. Pope Sixtus IV excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, meaning that no religious services could be performed in the city. The Florentine clergy, in a remarkable display of civic over religious loyalty, continued performing services anyway. The interdict was lifted 2 years later. The Pazzi conspiracy is relevant to the story of what happened after 1494 because it reveals something about the fragility of the Medici position that the conspiracy's failure made temporarily invisible. The Medici's power rested on a specific alignment of popular support, financial obligation, and papal relationship. When any of these elements shifted, the position was vulnerable. In 1494, the French invasion created conditions in which the popular support collapsed because Piero had squandered it. The papal relationship was severed because the papacy was not in a position to help. The financial obligations that had tied Florence to the Medici were superseded by the military emergency. All three elements shifted simultaneously, and the position that had survived a direct assassination attempt collapsed within days of Piero's return from the French camp. Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, inherited the bank and the political position in 1469 at the age of 20. He was not his grandfather. He was something different, something that the 15th century had not quite seen before. A ruler who was also an artist, a statesman who was also a poet, a banker who found the banking increasingly less interesting than the art and the politics it enabled. Lorenzo was brilliant. He was also, by the assessment of historians who have examined the bank's accounts, a significantly worse banker than his grandfather, or even his father. He used Medici money to finance his political position, and his cultural patronage in ways that Giovanni would have found alarming. The discipline of maintaining adequate liquidity, of ensuring that loans were recoverable, of not extending credit beyond what the security of the loan justified, these constraints that Giovanni had built into the bank's structure were progressively relaxed under Lorenzo's management. The London branch had extended large loans to Edward IV of England that were never fully repaid. The Bruges branch had a similar problem with Charles the Bold of Burgundy. The pattern across the bank's operations was of loans to monarchs and princes that were made for political reasons rather than commercial ones, that were extended on terms that reflected the borrower's importance rather than their creditworthiness, and that were not recovered when the borrower's circumstances changed. Commercial wealth, once the foundation of a Medici influence, became the casualty of political ambition. After 1494, this form of wealth disappeared. Lorenzo died in 1492. He was 43 years old. His death removed, as contemporaries immediately recognised, the intelligence that had maintained the delicate balance of Italian politics for 2 decades. The French invasion 2 years later was not caused by Lorenzo's death, but it was made more manageable for the French because the diplomatic architecture Lorenzo had built was no longer maintained by someone capable of maintaining it. His son Piero was not capable of maintaining it. Piero was 21 when Lorenzo died. He had his father's confidence and none of his judgment. When Charles the Eighth of France marched his army toward Florence in 1494, Piero rode out and gave away everything that Florentine strategy required to defend. The city revolted, the bank closed, the exile began. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara who had come to Florence in the early 1490s and had built a following through sermons that predicted divine punishment for Florence's corruption and luxuries. He had been preaching against the Medici and against Renaissance culture for years before 1494, and the Medici expulsion gave his movement the political opening it needed. Savonarola's takeover of Florence between 1494 and 1498 is usually presented as a story about religious extremism and its consequences. It is also a story about what happens to a city whose organising institution has been removed. The Medici had been Florence's organising institution for 60 years, not its government exactly, but the force that held the government functional, that managed the external relationships that a city-state of Florence's importance required, that provided the credit that the city's commerce needed, and the diplomatic intelligence that its security depended on. When the Medici left, all of those functions became the responsibility of a republican government that had not exercised them in 60 years. The government was not equipped to exercise them well. The political situation in Italy required a level of diplomatic sophistication that the new Florentine Republic simply did not have. The economic situation required access to credit that the Republic without the Medici's banking relationships could not easily arrange. Into this vacuum of competence came Savonarola, who offered certainty. His certainty was theological rather than practical. His answer to Florence's problems was repentance rather than diplomacy. But certainty itself has political value in moments of institutional breakdown. The bonfires of the Vanities were the most dramatic expression of the movement. Citizens were encouraged to bring works of art, books, mirrors, cosmetics, musical instruments, and other objects considered immoral to be burned in public fires. Some citizens complied voluntarily, others were coerced. The specific objects destroyed are not fully documented, but the best historical estimate is that significant works of art were lost, though some of what was supposedly burned survived, either because it was hidden or because the bonfires were less comprehensive than the historical legend suggests. Sandro Botticelli, who had painted for the Medici for decades, apparently burned some of his own works during this period. Whether he did so willingly, from genuine religious conviction, or under some form of social pressure is disputed. He continued to paint, and his later works show a distinctly more sombre register than the mythological paintings of the Medici period. Savonarola's movement collapsed when he was excommunicated by Pope Alexander VI in 1497, tried by the Florentine government in 1498, and burned at the stake in the same public square where he had organised his bonfires. Florence then tried to govern itself as a republic more effectively than it had done during the Savonarola years. It produced a civil servant named Niccolò Machiavelli and several decades of interesting political theory. It did not produce stability. The Republic lasted until 1512, when Spanish forces loyal to the papacy restored the Medici. The exile lasted 18 years. During those years, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola dominated Florence with a version of Christian extremism that made the Medici's cultural patronage look, in retrospect, like the work of civilized people. Savonarola organised the bonfires of the vanities, the public burning of mirrors, books, cosmetics, works of art considered immoral, and other objects that the friars' movement considered corrupting. He was eventually excommunicated by the Pope, arrested by the Florentine government, and burned at the stake in 1498. Florence then tried to govern itself as a republic. It struggled. The Medici watched from Rome and from Venice, and from the networks of relationship they had maintained across Italy and Europe. They were not passive, they were waiting. Their opportunity came through the church. Lorenzo had purchased a cardinalship for his second son Giovanni in 1492. Giovanni was 13 years old at the time. The purchase was made from the Medici Bank's resources, directed to the appropriate recipients in the papal court, in exchange for the appointment. This was not unusual. The sale of church offices was common enough in the 15th century that it had a name, simony. Lorenzo did what wealthy families did when they needed to place a son in a position of institutional power. Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X in 1513. He was 37 years old. With this rise to such heights, Giovanni, or His Excellency, refilled his family coffers through the sale of indulgences, or in simpler terms, the freedom from punishment of sins. This is the moment that the Medici story and the Protestant Reformation story intersect, and it is worth holding in mind. The financial practices of the Medici, applied to the church whose money they had managed for a century, helped produce Martin Luther's 95 Theses. Leo X's indulgence sales, which included a major campaign to fund the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, were among the specific practices that Luther attacked. The Reformation that divided Western Christianity for centuries was, in one of its proximate causes, the result of a Medici pope using the papal financial mechanism to restore the family fortune. Leo X sent the papal army to recover Florence for the Medici. He arranged the political marriage of his great niece Catherine de' Medici to the heir of the French throne. He re-established the family's position in Italy through the institutional power of the papacy in a way that neither money nor military force had been able to accomplish. The bank was gone. The papacy replaced it. Catherine de' Medici is the figure in whom the family's transformation from banking dynasty to European royalty is most completely expressed, and she deserves more attention than the standard account gives her. She was born in Florence in 1519, the daughter of Lorenzo II de' Medici and a French princess. She was orphaned within a month of her birth. Both her parents died within weeks of each other, her father from syphilis, her mother from puerperal fever, and Catherine was left in Florence as a ward of the Medici family, and then, as political circumstances changed, as a political hostage in various Italian convents. She was 13 years old when Pope Clement VII, her cousin, arranged her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orléans, the second son of King Francis II of France. She went to France. Henry became King Henry II when his older brother died unexpectedly. Catherine became Queen of France. She bore 10 children, 3 of whom became kings of France, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. She was regent during the minority of Charles IX, and one of the most consequential political figures in France during one of the most turbulent periods in French history. She governed France through the wars of religion, the conflict between Catholics and Huguenots that tore the country apart in the second half of the 16th century. Her role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which thousands of Huguenots were killed across France over several days, is disputed by historians and has been disputed since it happened. Whether she ordered the massacre, approved it after it began, or was manipulated into approving it by advisors who wanted it to happen, has been the subject of historical debate for 4 centuries. What is not disputed is that a woman who had been born an orphan in a politically turbulent Florence, who had spent her childhood as a political hostage, who had been married at 13 to the second son of a foreign king, had navigated the machinery of French royal politics well enough to govern the country for decades, and to put 3 of her sons on the throne. The banking family had produced a Queen Mother of France. The Fugger family of Augsburg replaced the Medici as the primary banking house of European power in the 16th century. This transition is the detail that most accounts of the Medici mention and then pass over, but it is the detail that answers the question of what happened to the banking network when the Medici Bank collapsed. The Fuggers had been accumulating capital through mining and textiles in southern Germany for decades before the Medici Bank closed. When the Medici's position as papal bankers and as the financiers of European monarchies became untenable, the Fuggers were positioned to fill the vacuum. Jacob Fugger, known as Jacob the Rich, financed the election of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. He lent money to the papacy. He controlled silver and copper mines across Central Europe. He was, by most estimates, the wealthiest private individual of the 16th century, achieving a position relative to European power that the Medici had held in the 15th century. The Fuggers, like the Medici, built their power on the intersection of finance and political connection. They lent to rulers. The rulers' debts made the rulers dependent on the bankers. The bankers' political connections made the bankers impossible to simply repudiate. The Fuggers eventually went into decline in the 17th century, as the flow of silver from the Americas inflated European currencies and disrupted the financial structures that their mining wealth had been built on. The specific mechanism of their decline was different from the Medici's, but the underlying pattern was the same. A banking family that had built its power on the intersection of finance and political connection found that the political connection had become more expensive to maintain than the commercial returns could justify. What the Medici and the Fuggers together established across the 15th and 16th centuries was the model that European banking would follow for the next 300 years. Private banking houses with political connections, financing states and monarchs in exchange for exclusive access to certain revenue streams, and for the protection that political support provides. The present-day financial system of international banking is deeply inspired by the practices of the Medici Bank. The specific practices include the letter of credit, which allowed merchants to transfer value across borders without physically moving gold, the bill of exchange, which created a market for currency conversion and international payment, the branch banking model, in which a central holding company maintains partial ownership of subsidiary institutions in multiple cities, and double-entry bookkeeping, which the Medici did not invent but which they systematized and deployed at a scale that made it standard practice. All of these are still in use. Every bank in the world today operates on accounting principles that the Medici standardized. Every international wire transfer is a direct descendant of the bill of exchange that Medici clerks processed in their branch offices across Europe. The Medici dukes who governed Florence from 1537 onward were not the direct descendants of Cosimo the Elder's main line. That line had effectively run out of capable males by the middle of the 16th century. Cosimo Thorn, who became the first Duke of Florence and later the first Grand Duke of Tuscany, was descended from a collateral branch, the descendants of Cosimo the Elder's brother Lorenzo the Elder. Cosimo Thorn was, by most historical accounts, a significantly more capable ruler than most of his predecessors. He was cold, efficient, occasionally brutal, and completely focused on the consolidation and maintenance of Medici power in Tuscany. He expanded the duchy's territory, reorganized its finances, and built the Uffizi, the administrative building along the Arno that later became the museum that bears that name, and that today houses the greatest collection of Italian Renaissance art in the world. He also collected. The Medici family had been collecting art for over a century by the time Cosimo Thorn added the ducal resources to the family's private patronage. The collection that accumulated across the 16th and 17th centuries under the Medici dukes and grand dukes became, by the end of the dynasty, one of the most extraordinary assemblages of art in human history. When the last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, died in 1743, she had no direct heirs. The Grand Duchy was inherited by the House of Lorraine through a complicated succession arrangement that had been established by treaty. Anna Maria Luisa negotiated a specific condition for the transfer. The art collection, the paintings, the sculptures, the antiquities, the coins, the manuscripts, the entire accumulated treasure of 3 centuries of Medici collecting would remain in Florence. It could not be removed. It would be available to the public and to visitors in perpetuity. Although the bank was lost, the fortune was not. Anna Maria Luisa turned what remained of the fortune, which was primarily the art, into a permanent public endowment. She created, through a single legal act, what became the Uffizi Gallery and the other Florentine museums that together constitute one of the most visited cultural destinations in the world. The family that had lost its bank in 1494 spent the following 2.5 centuries converting its remaining resources into art. The art in 1743 was converted into a public institution. The public institution is visited by approximately 4 million people per year. The physical legacy of the Medici in Florence is the most visible part of what they left behind, and it is worth tracing specifically because the relationship between the money and the objects it produced is more complicated than the standard art history account suggests. The Uffizi was built by Cosimo Theophane as a government office building. The name means offices. It was designed by Giorgio Vasari beginning in 1560, intended to house Florence's administrative and judicial functions in a building that also expressed Medici power through its scale, its design, and its location along the Arno directly adjacent to the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of Florentine government. The top floor of the Uffizi was used from early in its history to store parts of the Medici art collection, because the building's long galleries were suitable for displaying paintings. By the late 16th century, it functioned as both administrative building and private gallery accessible to selected visitors. Francesco I de' Medici built the Tribune, the octagonal room at the Uffizi's centre, in the 1580s, specifically to display the most prized objects in the Medici collection. The Tribune was designed as a room for wonder, with inlaid stone floors, mother-of-pearl shell ceilings, and niches for sculpture. It was the most concentrated display of wealth and beauty in a building full of concentrated displays of wealth and beauty. The Pitti Palace, which the Medici acquired in 1549, became the principal ducal residence and houses one of the other major components of the Medici collection, now called the Palatine Gallery. The Boboli Gardens behind the palace, which Cosimo III commissioned beginning in 1550, are the largest Renaissance garden in the world. The Medici chapels attached to the Basilica of San Lorenzo contain the ducal tombs designed by Michelangelo. The new sacristy, which Michelangelo built and decorated with the tombs of Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger and Giuliano de' Medici, contains some of the most significant sculpture of the Renaissance. The figures of night and day on Giuliano's tomb, of dawn and dusk on Lorenzo's. Michelangelo had grown up in the Medici household. Lorenzo the Magnificent had recognized his talent when the boy was approximately 13 and had brought him into the family's informal academy, the Garden of San Marco, where the Medici collection of ancient sculpture was displayed. Michelangelo studied and worked there for several years, in daily contact with Lorenzo and with the humanist scholars and artists the Medici had gathered around them. The relationship between Michelangelo and the Medici is the most concentrated example of what the Medici patronage actually was. Not merely a wealthy family paying artists to decorate their walls, but the creation of an environment in which extraordinary talent could develop in contact with the best models available and in conversation with the best minds of the age. The Medici did not create Michelangelo's talent, but they created the conditions in which that talent became what it became. The physical evidence of that creation is in Florence, in every city that has a Michelangelo in it, and in the entire subsequent history of Western art that was shaped by what Michelangelo produced. Anna Maria Luisa understood this when she negotiated her bequest. The art was not merely valuable, it was the physical evidence of what the family had made possible. Giving it to Florence permanently was not charity. It was the recognition that the art belonged to the civilization that had produced it, and that the Medici's role in producing it was the most honest claim to a lasting legacy that the family could make. The bank was gone. The political power was gone. What remained was what the money had been used to create. It remains. The specific conspiracy layer of the Medici story is not that they planned all of this, that the exile of 1494 was part of some deliberate long-term strategy to convert banking wealth into papal authority, into dynastic power, into cultural legacy. No family, however capable, plans across 2.5 centuries. The conspiracy layer is something more interesting and more unsettling. The Medici's innovations in banking, the structures they built to manage and move money across borders and generations, did not disappear when the bank closed. They were inherited by the institutions that replaced the Medici Bank. The papal banking relationship that Giovanni di Bicci had established passed to the Fuggers. The Fuggers' successors passed it to the houses that would become the great private banking dynasties of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Rothschilds, who built the next great European banking empire in the 19th century, operated on principles that the Medici had established in the 15th. The bill of exchange that the Medici branch offices used to transfer money across borders without physically moving gold was the prototype of the modern bank wire. The letter of credit that Medici merchants used to finance international trade was the prototype of the modern letter of credit. The holding company structure that Giovanni di Bicci used to protect the Florentine head office from the liabilities of its branches is the legal architecture of every multinational corporation operating today. These tools did not belong to the Medici. They were innovations that the Medici deployed at scale, and that became standard practice because they worked, and that passed to the institutions that replaced the Medici when those institutions needed to do the same things. Where the Templars had maintained independence from secular rulers, ultimately leading to their downfall, the Medici embraced political integration. They became bankers to popes, advisors to kings, and eventually rulers themselves. This approach created sustainable competitive advantages, and the approach itself was the lasting inheritance, not the bank. The bank closed in 1494. The approach it pioneered is still the operating model of every private bank with political connections in every country in the world. The specific financial innovations that the Medici deployed at scale deserve more detailed examination, because understanding what they invented explains why the Medici's influence on modern finance is real rather than merely metaphorical. The Bill of Exchange was the central innovation. Before the Bill of Exchange, transferring value across borders required physically moving gold or silver, which was expensive, slow, and dangerous. A merchant who needed to pay a creditor in London from resources in Florence either had to ship gold, which could be lost to theft or shipwreck, or had to find someone going to London who would carry value on their behalf for a fee. The Bill of Exchange solved this problem. A merchant in Florence would give gold to a Medici agent in Florence. The Medici agent in Florence would write a Bill of Exchange, a document promising that the Medici's London office would pay an equivalent amount in sterling to the bill's bearer at a specified date. The merchant could carry the document, which was far safer than gold, to London and exchange it there. The Medici made money on this transaction through the exchange rate. The rate at which florins converted to sterling varied and was somewhat discretionary. The spread between the rate at which the Medici bought florins in Florence and sold sterling in London was their profit. This was not technically interest, which the church prohibited, but it functioned as interest, which is why historians describe the Bill of Exchange as a mechanism for charging interest without calling it interest. The letter of credit worked similarly. A Medici letter of credit issued to a merchant said, in effect, that the Medici would honour the merchant's payments up to a specified amount. This allowed merchants to conduct business without carrying the full value of their transactions in cash. The credit of the Medici Bank stood behind the transaction. Both instruments required what the Medici's branch network provided, offices in the major commercial cities of Europe, staffed by agents who could honour the documents the central office issued. The network was the product. The paper instruments were the interface. The holding company structure that Giovanni di Bicci designed was the organisational innovation that made the network possible. Each branch was a separate legal partnership between the central Florentine firm and local partners who knew the local market and bore some of the local risk. The Florentine firm held a majority stake, which meant it received the majority of the profits, but the minority partners had skin in the game, which aligned their incentives with the branch's success. This structure also meant that if a branch failed, the failure was contained. The legal separation of the branches meant that creditors of the London branch could not reach the assets of the Florence branch. This was the same logic that limited liability later formalised in the joint stock company structure that became the standard form of business organisation in the 19th century. Giovanni di Bicci did not invent limited liability. He invented a practical approximation of it that worked well enough to manage an international network of banking offices across Europe for almost a century. The double-entry bookkeeping system that the Medici standardised required recording every transaction twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, in a way that made errors visible and fraud harder to conceal. The system had been developing in Italian merchant banking before the Medici, but the Medici's scale and sophistication in its application set the standard that others followed. Every accountant who practices today is practicing the discipline that Giovanni di Bicci's clerks practiced in Florence in the early 15th century. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence opened as a public museum in 1769, 26 years after Anna Maria Luisa's death. The collection that the Medici had assembled across 3.5 centuries, beginning with Cosimo the Elder's patronage of Donatello and Brunelleschi and Ghiberti, continuing through Lorenzo the Magnificent's relationship with Botticelli and the young Michelangelo, extending through the ducal period's edition of paintings by Raphael and Titian and hundreds of others. That collection received its first paying public visitors. The tourists who walk through the Uffizi today, nearly 4 million of them per year, walk past works that were commissioned or collected by people whose banking practices are still operating, whose political innovations are still in use, whose family name was carried by 4 popes and 2 queens of France, and who are otherwise completely extinct. The direct male line of the main Medici branch ended with Gian Gaston de' Medici in 1737. The female line ended with Anna Maria Luisa in 1743. The family, the specific biological family, is gone. The bank is gone. The political power is gone. The name, in the sense of living people who carry it, is gone. What remains is the method, the bill of exchange, the letter of credit, the branch banking structure, the separation of parent from subsidiary, double-entry bookkeeping at scale, the political integration of financial and governing power that made the Medici model so much more durable than any of its contemporaries. These are the actual inheritance, not the art, which is extraordinary and which Florence rightly treats as a public treasure. The method, which is invisible and which the world treats as natural because it has been standard practice for so long that its origins are forgotten. The family that produced Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent and Catherine de' Medici, and 2 Medici popes who shaped European history, built something that lasted longer than any of them. They built the architecture of modern banking. The building is still standing, the Medici are not, but the building was theirs, and in a specific, unsentimental sense it still is.